Well, a good Palm Sunday morning again to all of you. And we're going to be looking this morning at this hour, the subject of archaeology of Easter. So let me just, by way of introduction, say what we are looking at this morning happened. This Easter season is a matter of faith, but our faith is founded on facts. It's extremely important we understand that. And when we look at 1 John 1, it tells us that what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen, what we with our own hands have handled. This is the testimony of the apostles who were eyewitnesses to these things. They said concerning the word of life. This life was manifested. That is, it was visible. It was here. And in fact, when we talk about something like epiphany, a term used often in this season, it's the Greek word that means manifested, means to be made visible is the idea. We have seen, we have bear witness, and that this life was with the Father and manifested to us. So just as there were eyewitnesses of actual historical events that passed them on to us, we ourselves are witness of those things and pass them on to others. Because when we talk about archaeology, it is part of history. This is a science. We have history and we have the biblical text, but they intersect at points because those who wrote this word wrote them within the context of history. These things really happened. When we talk about religion, of course, there are many religions. They can't all be correct because they contradict each other. So you could say, well, none of them are correct. Well, then you're left with the unsatisfactory answers to the questions, the big ones. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? Nothing works well if you don't have something beyond just the hard sciences, which don't have the answers. So if they contradict, they can't all be correct, but one could be correct. And which one could be correct? Well, the one that has the most evidence. And that's what we have when we come to the Bible and we come to the Christian faith. We come to the Bible and archaeology. Unlike other religious books, the Bible's a narrative set in a historical setting. It doesn't pretend to just speak from a matter of faith. No, these things happen. These were eyewitness accounts that are given to us. And it talks about historical places and historical persons. Many of the historical places and people mentioned in the Bible can be checked out by archaeology. So we're not left to simply say, oh, I wonder if that happened. No, we have evidence that says it did. And the places and people, just like the other great figures of history, Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, known from historical writings, the Bible is an historical writing. But we have more evidence for the figures in the Bible than we do for Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. And when it comes to the fact that this word is more accurate in terms of historical information than any other account it's given, because it's earlier and there's more of them. We have much more evidence like this. Why is that important? Why does it matter? Well, it matters because we have statements of faith made in the Bible. You can't check those out because that's a matter of faith. But if that faith is tied to historical events and persons and places, then we can say if the people who recorded that did an excellent job, if they were accurate and trustworthy and careful, why wouldn't they be the same with matters of faith? Okay, if they're not lying about history, which would be easy to fabricate for people later on, why wouldn't they be the same way telling the truth about this account of Jesus? We do have skeptics, of course, but the excessive skepticism of many liberal theologians stems not from a careful evaluation of the available data, which is there, but from an enormous predisposition against the supernatural. People, when it comes to the things said in the Bible, it doesn't paint a pretty picture of us. We're fallen human beings. We're sinful human beings. We know that. It's why it's often difficult for people to come to a church because they say, I don't fit there. I don't belong there. I've done too much. I wouldn't feel comfortable there. People wouldn't feel comfortable with me being there. I mean, frankly, there's not a church that I know of that a King David could enter into, and many others. So look, the point is we're all sinners, and the Bible condemns us for that reason. And that's why we feel uncomfortable. And so we'd rather not have information. We'd rather just simply suppress that and put it away so we can just move on with our lives. But there's always that kind of gnawing feeling that what if it's true? Something that bothers me. And we keep pushing that down, but eventually it'll catch up to us. And on a Easter Sunday weekend like next weekend and today, Palm Sunday, we have that occasion where it does catch up with us because the history is clear, the events are clear. So the Bible and history say this happened. And as Christians, we need to master the case for the historicity of Jesus. You can't just walk around saying, well, Jesus said, or I believe in Jesus. What Jesus? Well, the Jesus of history, not the Jesus of your imagination or the Jesus of some television program that is dealing with the Christ of faith or some spiritual invention. No, the real Jesus who came here. And that's what we're going to look at. So we're going to look at the background of this Easter season, first with the events that led to the death of Jesus. That is the Roman trial of Jesus and then the Jewish trial of Jesus. Did this really happen? Now, I might say we have plenty of Roman sources. Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus, all of these wrote and give us written testimony about these events that happened. But we're going to look at the hard evidence, that is from the archaeological record, to say these people existed and the events they're a part of also happened. So we come to Pontius Pilate. In the Roman trial, this is laid out in the Gospels, that Jesus, Yeshua, is brought before Pontius Pilate. He is the Roman prefect. He's the governing authority. He has come down during this time of Passover, probably staying at the residence of Herod the Great, or now Herod Antipas, his successor. And there's a confrontation between him and Pontius Pilate, and the famous words when he says, "Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate responds, "What is truth?" Now, you have your truth, I have my truth. Truth is a very relative thing, but not when the absolute truth is standing before you speaking. We talk about Pontius Pilate. Archaeology revealed to us coins minted in his time, clearly specified him, even found his ring that says Pilato on it. It was found at a place called Herodian, where Herod the Great was buried. In 1961, there was a inscription found. This was at a place called Caesarea Maritima on the coast of Israel, Mediterranean Sea. And here's what it says. The text says, "In the 15th year of the government of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea and Herod being tetrarch." That much has been preserved of it. So you can see the words there. In Latin, Pilatus. It makes it quite clear. We can even read that ourselves. So when this was discovered, it was a dedicatory stone put up at Caesarea Maritima in order to honor Tiberius Caesar, who was then the head of the government, and Pontius Pilate basically under him. So we have all of this, and so it's there. We also know that he took him out at the end of the Roman trial and said, "I find no fault in him," and tried to get the audience, or at least the Jewish crowd, to excuse him. And Pilate said, "Behold, I'm bringing out to you that you may know I find no guilt in him." Jesus therefore came out wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe, both symbols, one of royalty, but also mocking. And he said, "Behold the man," the famous words, "ecce homo." And Pilate then said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the point is here, if he was really acknowledged as king, they would say no. But no, they all said, "We have no king but Caesar." And with those words, if he had let him go, then he could have been accused of some type of betrayal of Caesar, of exalting some person above him. So he let him out to be crucified. The place where that was done here is the remains of Herod's palace, and this is an audience hall outside the walls today. And this is probably the very place where Jesus was led out, and the crowds outside the wall were able to hear that kind of declaration. We come to the Jewish trial of Jesus. Now we're looking at a man named Caiaphas. Caiaphas is mentioned in the scriptures as the high priest at this time. He is quite frightened because of the miracles of Jesus and afraid that the Romans will come because of the messianic claims of Jesus and persecute not only the Jewish people, but remove them from their place of authority, because anybody who's a Messiah is actually a revolutionary. And Romans don't like revolutionaries. They like things nice and quiet. That's what they're trying to do, restore order. And so they want to do away with Jesus simply on that basis, to preserve the national security. So, but the place where Caiaphas had his headquarters, where there's a dungeon from the time of Jesus, is here. This is a reconstruction of it, but here's a street, the very type of street Jesus would have been led down. We come to the trial itself. Caiaphas is the one who presides over that. And he's the one that led Jesus. He was led away to Caiaphas, who now is the one in control. And Jesus confronts him and says, eventually you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, just like Daniel 7 had predicted. Well, was there a Caiaphas? Well, we know about his residence, but in 1990, trying to build a parking lot out in the northern part of Jerusalem, a place called Talpiot, they discovered this tomb with ossuaries. Ossuaries are bone boxes. This is what an ossuary looks like. The last part of the Second Temple period was an important period because it was very expensive to build a family tomb, and you didn't have enough room, so you waited about a year for the people who were put into the tomb to simply, let's say, be reduced to bones. Then you could gather their bones and put them in a separate box like this with their name scratched on the side, and then stack those things, then put someone new into that tomb space. So this is what this was. This is a very ornate ossuary, if you look at it, very beautifully done. Most of them are very plain, but this one obviously belonged to a wealthy person of high estate. And on the side of it, you can see here, a name scratch. We'll look at that again in a moment, but they found within this unopened tomb, never been exposed since the first century, bronze coins minted in the time in the 40s AD, about 10 years after the death of Jesus. It was identified as having the bones, I'll show you here, the bones of someone about 60 years of age. So here is the name scratched in the side, and it's Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Now his father probably was Caiaphas as well, so this is his name, but it's there, and the bones in there were dated, or at least tested to be someone about 60 years of age. So you have an ornate ossuary, you have a name. The Bible only gives his name as Caiaphas, but Josephus Flavius, the first century Roman historian, gives his name as Joseph Caiaphas. So we have all the data there. And then we have another ossuary that was in there as well, Miriam, daughter of Yeshua. So that's a very common name, Yeshua, because it's the same name as Joshua, famous figure in the Bible. So Jesus is a very common name. But this is the daughter of Yeshua, the son of Caiaphas. So again mentioned, we have two ossuaries that mention his name like that. And because it identifies him as a priest of Mosiah from Beit Imri, we can now historically place him in that priestly course instituted by King David. So a lot of details and facts here. So we have Caiaphas. Here's the inscription written on the top of that ossuary. So that moves us to the crucifixion of Jesus. And the question, was Jesus crucified? Well, Bar Ehrman, who once was an evangelical, he deconstructed his faith and now is a skeptic. But even he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And he affirms, yes, Jesus did exist. And he makes this statement concerning crucifixion. It is highly improbable that the earliest Palestinian Jewish followers of Jesus would have made up the claim that the Messiah was crucified. I mean, this is your top dog. This is your hero. And crucifixion is, it's a shameful thing. It's reserved for the worst of criminals. Why would you do such a thing? You could just make that up. It's not part of the story, unless it's part of God's story, from early Messianic prophecy forward. We have the Roman statement. Here is Tacitus, one of the Roman historians. He's writing about the Christians in the context of the burning of Rome by Nero and explaining why this happened. But he mentions here Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So the Romans give us that historical note, and they say Pilate did it, and not only that, it was by the act of crucifixion. That's the extreme punishment or penalty they're talking about. We look for evidence of these things. We have another ossuary. These are very helpful things to have. And with the end of the Second Temple period, with the destruction of the temple in AD 70, these disappear. They're no longer in use. So it's just about 150 years they actually where this practice existed. But here, on this bone box, you see scratched in a name, and I can read Yochanan at the top, and then it says Ben Hagakol. So it's a man named Yochanan, the son of Hagakol. And this was discovered at a place called Givat HaMiftar, again near Jerusalem. And if we look at it, what was in the bone box that was interesting was a heel bone with a nail driven through it. And this is actually the first archaeological evidence of crucifixion. You say, I don't get it. I mean, tens of thousands of people were crucified. When you read about something like one of the big uprisings against the Romans. Well, the Maccabees, yeah, it happened with them too. In fact, John Hyrcanus, who was a king in the Maccabean reign, crucified 800 Pharisees at one time because of things. I'm thinking of, Kirk Douglas played the lead role in the movie. I can't. Spartacus, okay, that was it. All right, so, in that movie, they lined up people all up and down the roads with being crucified. So you say, well, if that many people were crucified, why do we don't have any evidence of it? Because they reused everything. Okay, you just had a basic part of a tree sitting there. Someone carried the cross beam with them. They nailed them up there, and they pulled the nails out, reused them for the next guy. Same thing with the cross beam. So, that's very utilitarian. Why waste anything? So it just gets recycled, and then the same nails can be used for something else, because you'd have to have a victim buried with the nails still in them, and this is the example of the case here. So Yochanan, it's like that. If you look carefully at the heel bone, you can see the reason why we have it. When the nail was driven through, it hit some kind of a knot hole or something and bent back. They couldn't pull the person off, and they needed to. So they just took the leg, the nail, even part of the wooden cross, and that's how we know the wood of the cross was olive wood. Very, very common wood there, but that's also there. So you can see a piece of that. Well, that tells us something interesting, something we really didn't know. It shows, while we know Jesus was crucified historically, we didn't know exactly how he was crucified. So when you find these kind of bones, you can see how the nailing would have happened from the side of the foot through the heel bone. And now we have some others. There was one found in Venice in 2007. Same position for the nails. Now, when you look at a typical crucifix, it's based on a couple of things. Some of them will have the feet nailed both in the front, or most times just one nail through 2 feet. Okay, so because we didn't have the historical reality of it, just simply this is how they thought it was done. Now we know better. We know that, and what this does, it tells us that his suffering, at least humanly, at least physically, was more intense than we could have ever imagined. Okay, because now you're standing on your feet to take the weight off so you can breathe, okay? And when you do that, there's intense pain, and so you have to let go. But now the weight's on your wrist and arms, so it's a back and forth. It can go on literally for days sometimes until the person finally, expires. Generally of something like dehydration, or his heart fails because of the position he's in. So we know how this looked. They found things also at the Palatine Hill in Rome about the mid-200s. Here is someone mocking a believer in Jesus. And what they have is they have the cross, and you can see how the figure is positioned on the cross, but he's making fun of it. They use a donkey head because that is considered an animal of very low status. We still make fun of people calling him a donkey like this. And so they put that on the figure. And then it has, in Greek, it says, Alexamenos worships his God. So we know it's a picture of Jesus being crucified from this. But you can see again the position. Now I might ask the question, well, why was Jesus crucified? We may never ask that question, but it's an important question, because when we come to John 19, in this whole situation where the Jewish authorities are coming to Pilate to ask him to crucify Jesus, he says, therefore, when the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out saying, crucify, crucify. And Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. Jesus and the Jews answered him, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. But here's the question. If making himself out to be the Son of God is blasphemy, then they had a law that allowed them to do that, and that's called stoning. All right? They practice stoning. You'll see that in just a moment. But then Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And they said, we have no king but Caesar, and this and that. There's more to this, though, and John mentions it as well. The Jewish authorities had the legal right to execute anyone they tried and found guilty of violating Jewish law. This was recognized by the Romans. Why did the Jewish authorities contend they were not permitted to put anyone to death? That's what John 18:31 says. The clue is in the next verse, John 18:32, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. All right, so again, Jews had the right to stone, to execute by stoning. Here in Acts 7, Stephen is stoned to death, and who is responsible for that? The Apostle Paul, then Shaul or Saul, and so this took place after the death of Jesus, demonstrating they always had that right. So something has to do with the kind of death. And Jews did not have the right to crucify. That was a Roman execution. And somehow, according to Jewish law, they thought he needed to be crucified by the Romans. So why all the bother? Why all the problem? Well, we didn't know until we found in Cave 11, this is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the scroll cave, and this is the scroll. It was called the Temple Scroll. It's the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, about 27 feet long. And in this, we read this particular discussion about legal matters. It says, if a man is a traitor against his people and gives them up to a foreign nation, so doing evil to his people, that is, he's a seditionist, you are to hang him on a tree until dead. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, he will be put to death, and they themselves shall hang him on a tree. Now, this statement goes back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, where it gives that type of legal precedent. And Paul mentions in Galatians 3:13, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. Curses everyone who hangs on a tree. So what is happening here? Well, according to this, the legal punishment for someone who is a seditionist was hanging on a tree. What's the closest thing to hanging on a tree? Crucifixion. And that is a Roman execution. So in order to be, shall we say, halakhically or Jewish legally correct, he had to be crucified. Isn't that interesting? And we know this is some of what's going on because in John 11:49, right in the context of our Palm Sunday account, you have them come to Caiaphas, and they say, if this man goes on like this, the Romans are going to come and take away both our place and our nation. They're going to remove us from power because he's a revolutionary. And Caiaphas says it's better that one man die than the whole nation perish. So they have this understanding of sedition. He's betraying the nation. And so being called a son of God here is a messianic claim from Daniel 7. They're not looking at blasphemy, they're looking at sedition. But we would have never known that without the archaeological record. So now we see why it was necessary for the Sanhedrin to turn Jesus over to the Roman authorities for judgment. Talk about the burial of Jesus. There was a specific place for that. That, I think, has been located. There's a lot of archaeological evidence for that. We have two places today where it's spoken of. One is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has a number of various denominations connected with it because it's been there since the beginning. And then we have what's called the Protestant site. The Protestant site is called Gordon's Calvary, or the Garden Tomb. One has the archaeological evidence, that's the first one, the oldest one. The other does not. It's a nice place to commemorate things. I take our tour groups there. We have a communion service. It's a wonderful situation because it's unspoiled. Whereas this is built over by churches, and you go in, you have people swinging incense and yelling at you because you haven't bought their candles, all the things that go on with it. But this is probably exactly the place. And we know that in the time, here's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You have first this building called the Archaeological, which is where the tomb of Christ was. So that was the burial site. But we also have Golgotha, the place where the crucifixion was. So kind of stripping things away, you have a stone quarry there from the very beginning. Excavations that were done by Dan Bahat back in the 1980s, I think, found this stone quarry. That was generally a place of execution. If you want to look at something like this in terms of something more familiar to our eyes, it would look something like this. The crucifixion site would be in this quarry, stone quarry, one because it was accessible and open. It was near an open street, and the Romans particularly picked public sites, visible sites where people would walk by because they wanted crucifixion to be a deterrent to people who would commit crimes. So, that's why we used to have public hangings, all the things we did to say, if you don't do right, you'll end up like him. And that was the idea. So you say, well, what about Golgotha, the place of the skull? Well, it tells us that it's related to a skull because a skull is a picture of death. And a crucifixion site is where death takes place. Just like you look at a pirate flag, it has, the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones. Or used to have poison with a skull and crossbones on it, so you'd know, don't drink this. This is poison. Same idea. The idea of a skull was associated with death, not necessarily that something was shaped like a skull. So we have the crucifixion site, and then we have the tomb. As I said, another guy says no one in the first century would have invented a story about a crucified man as a divine savior and king of the world. Something extreme and dramatic must have happened to lead people to accept such an idea. And that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:23, we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. I mean, why in the world would you worship a guy that was considered a common criminal and died in such a way? Well, that's what we're about to get to. Did he die? Yeah, because if someone died and he was claimed to be a Messiah, and there were lots of them in those days, you just went and found another one that was still alive, followed him. Why is it that this one who died, a whole movement developed, which is still here to this day, and not just a movement from within Orthodox Judaism, with thousands and thousands of people claiming something that Judaism itself said was blasphemy? How could you have that happen if it didn't happen? Now, looking at the place, here's the Temple Mount, here's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over here, and you can see, looking at these buildings again, we have I'll put them up here. Here's the site of crucifixion. that small gray dome. If you were to go into this building, it's hard to see anything because it's built over everything that's there. But there's a stone quarry. There's a big piece of rock jutting up. When you go into the Church Holy Sepulchre, you walk in immediately to your right, you go upstairs. That's the place of the nailing and the place of the crucifixion, and then you go back down the stairs to get to the place of the tomb. So that still exists, but it's covered by buildings. But we know it's there. So the site of the resurrection, or the tomb of Christ, is just adjacent to it. So here is what it would look like today if you went in. Very interestingly, people have wondered, well, you know, they claim this thing is old, but the church was built by Justinian in the 6th century. Before that, it was identified by Queen Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, in the 4th century. Before that, Romans built a temple of Aphrodite there. How do we know this is what it is? That there was a tomb with a rolling stone, as they say. Well, first off, rolling stone tombs are quite rare because only the wealthy could afford them, and most tombs would have a plug in it. And yet the scriptures are quite clear that this was a stone that was rolled away, even in one sense thrown away from the entrance to the tomb. Well, they did excavations, and this is National Geographic's pictures, and when they did this, they found beneath the present slab that was covering it from the 4th century AD, all right, which they thought was the oldest, they found an earlier one from the 1st century AD, already with a cross in it. So we now know that this site claimed to be the tomb of Jesus went back to the 1st century AD. Beyond that, as they excavated, they found fragments of bricks stamped with the 10th Roman Legion. These are the guys that destroyed the temple in AD 70. So it all fits the time period. And by the way, for at least almost 2,000 years, there's no other claimant to this. There's no rival. This was the place. And if you go just, let's say maybe 100 feet from the place that has the big tomb over it, you have more of those same tombs. This was a tomb complex. This is what it looks like. This was, I always take our groups in there because can't even get into the other place. So let me show you what the tomb really looked like. This is right. And these are clearly Roman tombs from the 1st century. And so you would have had a rolling stone, you would have had an entry area, and then you would have had these these are called coquim tombs, where the body was placed inside. So looking at that, we have to ask the question, you know, here is a slab, the body was there. Everybody observed that. The apostles that went in, Miriam who went in, others went in, saw not the body of Jesus, where they had laid him. They were coming back to do more with the spices and put things in, but all they saw was the wrappings. And according to John, everything was wrapped. You could tell it's like someone's like a cocoon. They'd wrapped the body up, but it had just gone away, and the remains were there. Even the thing that was on his head, the napkin that was wrapped around it, was wrapped and folded and set aside. Not just because Jesus was a neatnik, okay, but because he wanted to say, you know, I was here, and I stacked it right there. So we come to the resurrection of Jesus, which is probably the fundamental point defining Christianity. Because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you're still in your sins. Your faith is in vain. It didn't happen. It doesn't matter. You can have some nice, warm, fuzzy feelings about Jesus, but if he couldn't do what he promised to do, forget him. But you can't forget him if it really happened. So let me mention some things in relation to this. First, we have the Nazareth inscription. This was found in Nazareth back in the 19th century. It's an imperial edict, either from the reign of Tiberius or more likely Claudius from around 41 AD. It's a strong warning about meddling with tombs and graves. The punishment for doing so was death, and it was obviously the result of a report from Pilate or someone that was concerned about empty tombs. Okay? So here's what the edict says. It says, Edict of Caesar. It is my decision, graves and tombs, whoever has made them for religious observances of parents or children or household members, that these remain undisturbed forever. If anyone legally charges that another person has destroyed or in any manner extracted those who have been buried, or has moved with wicked intent those who have been buried to other places. Now that's a very interesting statement. Why would you do that? Okay, and that's exactly what the disciples are accused of having done by the Jewish authorities. They took his body away. It says, committing a crime against them, or has moved sepulchre sealing stones. That was also what happened at the resurrection. The seal was broken, the stone was moved. Against such a person, order that a judicial tribunal be created concerning the gods and human religious observances. It'll be obligatory to treat with honor those who've been entombed. You're absolutely not allowed to move. But if so, I wish that one to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker. So if you look at that, those key lines were cast out those buried, or remove them to other places, or let no one move them. Okay, suffer capital. So this is all about removing bodies. Now, at the time of this, in the Easter season, we read about the soldiers who were keeping guard, and they claim they fell asleep. Well, now that's a difficult thing, because we know from both the Polybius, a Roman writer, that the penalty for soldiers who fell asleep on duty was death by your comrades. They usually stripped you of your clothes, they set them on fire, and you with them. And that was done. The same, but for even lesser charges, that it was done by the Jewish temple guards. So it was also a very severe event. And that's why when we look at this, you see the Sanhedrin say this, and if you get in trouble, we will intercede for you. We'll take care of it. Okay, so apparently they had the clout to bribe people to overlook it. That's what was happening. Now, it was fake news the disciples stole the body. In fact, if they had stolen the body, why weren't they pursued for the crime of stealing the body? It was not an issue. It was not a big deal. They were in public after this preaching, even got arrested a number of times, never accused of this nor punished for this. So that's very interesting. Now, I won't go through the details here. This is Acts 1, 12 to 26. But what it tells us is this. It tells us about an individual named Barsabbas. There was another one named Matthias. Basically what happened, because Judas was numbered with the 12 originally and he killed himself, they had to replace that to have the 12 disciples. So after this event, they drew straws to see who God would indicate would be one of these. And the requirement here, it says this has to be someone, and it says right down the middle, of the men who have accompanied us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning with the baptism of John until the day he was taken up from us. One of these should become a witness with us of his resurrection. So you had to have been there the whole time, seen everything, been a part of the inner circle. And they had two people put forward. One was Matthias. The other was a man named Barsabbas. Barsabbas didn't get it. Matthias did. You don't hear much about him, but he was the one that got it. He was numbered with the 11. But somewhere, probably back in the 60s or 70s, I'm not sure of the date, I'm probably the only person that has this information that I know of, because I got it from the man whose father was head of the Antiquities Authority in Israel. He was an historian at Hebrew University. He passed it on to me before he died. And so these are the only pictures and things we have. But there was a tomb that was found out here near the railroad station on the way to Ramat Raquel, what's called the road to Hebron or to Bethlehem today. And this was the tomb. It had never been opened. It was a sealed tomb. Particularly looking at number 4 down here on this, but these are the layout of the tomb. Here's the only picture I have of what it looked like on the inside. Here's another picture showing the tombs, these Kokim tombs with the slab. Now that we go in front, not a rolling stone, but just something like this that covered it. But here, no longer ossuaries, and probably because Jesus had some negative statements about ossuaries. Here is a sarcophagus. And it's dated to AD 41, about 10 years, or maybe a little less, maybe 8 years after Jesus' death, because there was a coin found in there. And it was the latest coin was AD 41, so it couldn't be any later than AD 41, because that was the seal. The tomb was sealed then. But on these bone boxes, you see a cross which indicates Christian burial. And we look at the inscription on the edges of the thing, and here's what it says. It says, Shimon Bar Saba, and then it has a dedication to Yeshua ben Yosef Le'alat, who ascended. Well, this is a theological statement that he ascended, but it's clear this is the guy who was there, an eyewitness to it. So they put this on there. It's a very clear statement that, if you're going to ascend, you have to have resurrected first. So this is a clear picture of that. Here's the area of Israel known as the Shephelah. You can see Hebron at the bottom, and so we have Lachish over here, but between it there's a place called Beit Loya. This was excavated probably about 15 years ago by the guy I work with in archaeology, Orrin Gutfeld, and they found something very interesting there, a cave. And here's the entrance to the cave. There's a big fig tree right in front of it, so you have to crawl through the fig tree to get down into the cave itself. But when you get to the cave, there's an inscription on the entrance to the cave. A Greek inscription. Just to show you how big that is, here's someone standing by it. So it's a very large inscription. So let's look at the inscription. It's dated to either the late 2nd century or early 3rd century. It's written by Christians, obviously, because you can already see a cross there. But looking at this, here's the word. The word Jesus is there in Greek. So we have Jesus, and then we have the word hode in Greek, which means present. And so it's translated, Jesus is present. Well, what would that be about? And then, of course, you see crosses of different forms there. So obviously, this is a place of Christian veneration. It's very similar, of course, to the statement in Matthew 18, where he says, if 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there, or I'm in your midst. So this is a picture of Jesus with them. Well, how could they assume Jesus was with them in their worship if Jesus hadn't been risen from the dead? So again, a testimony clearly that this happened. If you want to know more about some of that, my friend and colleague Gary Habermas just put out the first volume of 4 volumes on the resurrection. This first volume is over 1,000 pages on just the evidence. So if you're worried about there being more evidence, there's plenty. I was just giving you archaeological evidence. He gives many more evidences. So this book was just published. 3 more big volumes to go. Let's conclude by looking at the deity of Jesus, because if he died and rose again, then who is he? He must be exactly who he said he was, the Lord God. Here's an archaeological example of that from the 3rd century. It's actually the oldest church ever found in the Holy Land. It was beneath the floor of a prison near Megiddo, and they excavated there to do some plumbing work and found this, and you can see the 2 mosaics from above. One mosaic has the early symbolism for the Christians. The fish ichthus, is simply an acrostic for each letter, then stands for the Greek word for Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. That's what's there. The other inscription is very interesting because it is part of a table and it's dedicated. It says, the God-loving Ekleptos, who is the dedicated this, has offered this table to the God, Jesus Christ. So from the very beginning, Jesus was considered God in the flesh. God came, according to all the promises made in the Old Testament, to fulfill just those things. So I'm just showing you testimonies and evidence that we have. Remember that when we talk about excavations, only about 1% of available sites or of important sites in the whole land have been excavated. 1%. That 1% is very telling. It aligns with the Bible in very unique and significant ways. So for us, our faith is based on facts. This isn't just something that you dreamed up or thought it was a good idea or is as good as some other religion. No. True Christianity is set forth in the Bible as a credible faith, not one based on emotions or superstitions or groundless belief. Christianity alone is based on verifiable historical truth. God repeatedly challenges us to examine and test these claims. Each person is responsible to investigate the Bible's claims of authenticity for themselves. Even though it's uncomfortable, you got to do it because your eternal destiny depends on it. Let me just say, if you'd like a little more information on some of these things, I have a website, worldofthebible.com. That will give you a lot of more information like this. And at those sites, we also do tours of the Bible lands. We're doing next year, 115th tour. So we've been there a bit, so we could give you some good information. We have a couple of things. I have some books about Israel, and then I have an Evangelical Study Bible, which I contributed to. 100 archaeological full-color notes I did in there, as well as a number of the other books of the Bible, the footnotes and things. So, John?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. If you'll come, just close us out.